Hello, guys. Tonight, if you are listening to this when the room has already grown quiet, when the light has softened, and the outside world has begun to recede behind half-closed eyelids, try to imagine something. Thousands of years ago, on pieces of clay still damp before the sun had time to dry, their surface human beings bent down and carved names into them. Not the names of people, not the names of kings, but the names of places. And to understand why that mattered so deeply, we must return to a time when the world had no maps, no compass, no concept of borders as we understand them today. We return to the age of Sumer, where people lived between two rivers, where water was both a gift and a threat that never truly slept. There no one could see the whole world from above. No one knew for certain whether they stood at the center or at the edge of anything. The only thing people could hold on to were landmarks, places that had once saved them or once brought them to collapse. A bend in the river where the waters receded at the right season. A stretch of higher ground that did not flood when the waters rose. A temple where rituals were performed and order seemed to return after chaos. These places were remembered not because they were beautiful, not because they were wealthy, but because they allowed life to continue. And when human memory was not strong enough to carry such knowledge across generations, people did something very slow, very careful, and very serious. They carved that memory into the earth, not to guide the feet, but to guide order, to guide memory, to guide the way people understood where they were standing in a vast and unpredictable world. In those ancient texts, the name Anunnaki appears, not as beings from a distant sky, but as principles that kept the world from sliding into chaos. And alongside them, the same place names return, again and again. Why? Tonight we will not search for spacecraft. We will not chase a hidden planet. We will not hunt for sensational secrets. We will do something far quieter. We will trace a map written in memory. When we read humanity's earliest ancient texts, the first thing we must learn is not how to pronounce a name, but how to restrain our imagination. Because those texts were not written for us. They were written for a world that was not accustomed to certainty. It was a world where the sky was truly dark. Not the darkness of a room with the lights turned off, but a deep, dense darkness stretching from one horizon to the other. When the sun went down, the night was not softened by electric light. There was only the moon, the stars, and shadows deep enough for people to feel clearly how small they were. In that world, the sky was not merely a backdrop. It was a clock, a calendar, a set of signs that told you when to sow seeds, when to wait for the waters to retreat, when to pray, and when to be afraid. Every star that rose and set carried meaning. Every small disruption in the sky's rhythm could be understood as an omen of a season that would not cooperate, of a flood arriving too early, or of an order that was beginning to loosen. Back then, people did not stand apart from nature to observe it from a distance. They lived inside nature. They woke with the first light. They rested when darkness forced them to stop. Time was not divided by hours and minutes, but by the length of a shadow, by the rhythm of winds shifting direction, by the river's level rising or falling. Every day was a silent negotiation between human beings and the world around them. Water brought life, but it could also sweep everything away. Soil allowed planting, but only if people read the season signs correctly. Wind cooled the heat, but it also carried sand dust and the harshness of arid lands. In that world, there was no concept of long-term stability. Everything could change after a single cycle of nature. A rainy season falling out of rhythm. A year when the water did not return on time. A flood arriving before the grain could be harvested. Human existence always stood close to the edge of collapse. And that is why what was recorded in texts was not written to satisfy curiosity, but written as things that must not be forgotten. Not every story was worth writing. Only what was tied to survival, to order, to the ability to live through the next season, deserved to be pressed into clay and carried across generations. And when we read those lines today, if we bring with us a modern imagination, an imagination accustomed to light, to maps, to relative safety, we can easily mistake a world of fragile balance for a world of theatrical mystery. That is why, before we understand the names, we must understand the world that gave birth to them. In that world, a name appears that still confuses us thousands of years later: Anunnaki. Today, that name is often torn from its context. It is placed into stories of distant planets, of beings descending from the sky, of lost technology, of knowledge hidden behind curtains of secrecy. Those stories are fascinating. They satisfy modern curiosity, a curiosity shaped by science fiction, by the idea that anything truly great must have come from somewhere beyond Earth. But that is precisely where we begin to stray from the path of the ancient texts, because the first people who carved that name into clay did not live in a world with the concept of another planet. They had no vocabulary for technology beyond comprehension, and they did not try to explain the world by stories that escaped it. If we return to where that name was first written, to the world of Sumer, Anunnaki appears in a very different way, less dramatic, less visual, but far more profound. In Sumerian texts, Anunnaki does not enter the story as a main character. They are not introduced through heroic deeds. There is no birth scene, no moment of personal glory, no journey through trials in the sense we recognize from Greek myth or later epics. They do not go anywhere, and they do not come from anywhere. Anunnaki appears as something already there, something assumed a part of the order. Human beings step into the moment they are born. In that world, divinity does not need to be narrated to become important. It is important because it functions. Anunnaki is not mentioned for entertainment. Their name is invoked at moments when order must be affirmed, when laws are proclaimed, when power is granted to a king, when a city must be certified as legitimate, when people face disaster and need to believe that beneath everything, a deeper structure still holds the world in place. Therefore, Anunnaki does not appear as individuals with distinct personalities. They do not love or hate, betray, or atone the way later human storytelling would portray gods. They appear as a collective power, a group of principles personified just enough for people to call them by name, but not specific enough to become characters with private lives. This is crucial, because it shows us that Anunnaki was not created to answer the question, who did what? They exist to answer a different question, one far deeper. Why has this world not collapsed? In Sumerian, thought the universe is not a perfect machine. It must be maintained, adjusted, named correctly in order to keep functioning. And Anunnaki is the name for that very function. Not beings who descended from the sky, but that which keeps sky, earth, water, humanity, and law from sliding apart. That is why Anunnaki does not need a biography. They are not born. They do not die. They do not leave the world. They are present whenever order is repeated, and they quietly vanish when that order is treated as self-evident. And from here we begin to understand that if we read Anunnaki as aliens, we do not merely misunderstand them, we misunderstand how ancient people saw their own world. They appear as a collective. Even within the structure of Sumerian language, the name Anunna, or Anunnaki, already implies something important. This is not a single god, but a group of authority. Ancient texts describe them as the offspring of An and the sky god. Not the sky in a merely physical sense, but the sky as a principle, that which is above, encompassing everything, untouchable, uncontrollable, and therefore considered the most stable. In Sumerian, thought the sky does not change as quickly as the earth. It does not crack. It does not drift away. It is not carried off by floods or burned by drought. When people looked up into the night sky, they saw a repeating order. Stars returned to familiar positions. Cycles followed one another with a precision that made people believe that somewhere there was an unshakable foundation, and therefore did not need to act. He did not need to intervene. His existence was itself proof of order. But here something that seems contradictory appears. Anunnaki, the offspring of An, does not live in the sky. They do not dwell among the stars. They do not remain above, looking down upon the human world. Nor do they leave the earth only to return later, like characters in modern stories. On the contrary, Anunnaki is present much lower than that. They are present in the operating structure of the human world. This is not a paradox. It is a very clear division of roles within an ancient cosmic worldview. An represents absolute stability, an order too vast to intervene in the details of daily life. Anunnaki as offspring are the principles that bring that order down to earth. They do not create law out of nothing. They make law legitimate. They do not build cities. They confirm that a city stands in the correct place within the world's order. In ritual texts, Anunnaki does not appear randomly. They are invoked only at very specific moments. When law is established, not law as a command, but law as a commitment, that this society will function according to a pattern that can be anticipated. When power is transferred, not merely handing over a crown, but transferring responsibility for keeping order from collapsing under the weight of human beings. When a city is recognized, not because it is populous, but because it is considered a legitimate node, a point where people land ritual and law meet, and especially when order must be reaffirmed after crisis, after drought, after floods, after war, after signs suggesting the world has slipped out of its familiar rhythm. In those moments, people did not ask, who caused this? They asked a different question. How can the world return to the right place? And the answer was not in some distant sky, but in naming correctly the principles that had once kept the world standing. Anunnaki in those texts is not a set of acting characters. They are a support, a system of sacred authority that allows people to believe that the order they are trying to restore is not merely a desperate effort, but a return to a structure that existed before them. And precisely because they are present at that level of operation between An's unchanging sky and the Earth's shifting human world, Anunnaki does not need the sky to live. They live in law, in ritual, in the city, and in collective memory of how the world is meant to function. In other words, Anunnaki does not represent creation, but stability after creation. In Sumerian cosmology, the world is not a fixed thing. It always tends to slip toward chaos, to slip toward imbalance, to slip toward a condition in which humans cannot survive. Anunnaki appears exactly on that boundary. They do not create the river, but they ensure the river flows in the right season. They do not create laws, but they legitimize those laws through sacred authority. They do not rule every individual, but they sponsor the structure of rule. That is why Anunnaki is often tied to specific places: temples, cities, ritual centers, points where power is concentrated, memory is preserved, and order is repeated. This matters, because it shows us that Anunnaki does not exist independently of space. They do not wander. They do not travel. They are anchored to place names, but not place in the modern geographic sense, rather place in the sense of social and cosmic function. In hundreds of surviving cuneiform texts, Anunnaki is mentioned in very specific contexts, not when people tell stories for entertainment, but when they need to be sure that the order they live within is legitimate: a treaty, a coronation ritual, a prayer when drought stretches on, a fear that the world is slipping from its familiar course. In those moments, Anunnaki is invoked as a way of saying, this order is not merely a human decision. It is placed within a deeper structure of the world. This is why in modern scholarship, Researchers, such as Samuel Noah Kramer, do not treat Anunnaki as characters in the usual mythological sense, but as an operating concept, a concept that allowed Sumerian society to link three layers of reality: nature, water, land, seasons, society, law, power, city, cosmos, order, time, legitimacy. And because Anunnaki operates at that connecting layer, they are never described in detail by appearance. There is no portrait, no consistent physical description, no personal birth and death narrative. What we see is the name, a name repeated, placed in the right position, used at the right moment. In a culture where personal memory is fragile and writing is still scarce, repetition is not a lack of creativity. It is a survival strategy. Each time Anunnaki is invoked, it is not to retell an old story, but to activate a familiar order. And from here, we begin to understand why the place names associated with Anunnaki return again and again in a way that seems suspicious. Not because the Sumerians knew no other places, but because those places held an irreplaceable role within the structure of their world. Anunnaki, therefore, is not something that came from somewhere far away. It is how ancient people named stability in a world that always stood on the verge of collapse. And as we continue this journey, what we need to do is not ask, where did the Anunnaki come from? But where were they invoked, and why only in those places? That question will lead us to a map not drawn, but remembered more durable than any parchment or carved stone. When we talk about maps today, we think about distance, about routes, about locating ourselves relative to some point on the surface of the earth. A modern map is designed to answer a single question: where am I? But in the ancient world, that was not the most important question, because people back then rarely traveled far beyond familiar space. Most of their lives unfolded within a radius their feet could reach and return from within the same day. What they needed to know was not where they were, but what kept this world from collapsing. And it is here that the idea of a map begins to take on a completely different meaning. In ancient thought, a map was not born to measure distance. In the world of Sumer, there were no maps in the geometric sense we know today. There were no carefully calculated scales, no coordinate grids dividing space into even squares, and no fixed directions clearly marked north, south, east, and west as on modern maps. But that absence does not mean ancient people were vague about the space around them. On the contrary, they knew the way in another manner, a manner bound tightly to survival. They knew very well where water could be found, not on paper, but through the memory of seasons of rising and retreating waters. They knew which places were safe when floods rose unexpectedly, and which places to avoid when the river changed course. They knew which lands could endure the long heat of the dry season, and which lands would quickly become barren if they planted at the wrong time. They also knew where a temple should be built, not merely because the location was convenient, but because their ritual had once been performed, and order had once been felt to return. And they knew very clearly which places should not be settled, even if they seemed safe on the surface, because collective memory still held the losses that had occurred there. That kind of knowledge was not stored as the shape of space, as length or direction, but as function. Each place was remembered by what it had done for the community, and what it might do again when the world shifted its rhythm. So, for ancient people, a map was not a surface to look at. It did not need to be spread out before the eyes to determine location. A map was a structure for remembering a way of arranging the world in the mind based on degrees of safety, degrees of necessity, and degrees of what must not be forgotten. And from that kind of map-important place, names were preserved across generations, not because of where they were, but because if they were forgotten, the order that made survival possible might no longer stand. A modern map is often created to answer one question, a question that is practical, direct, and familiar. How do I get from A to B? That question assumes movement is central to human experience, that the world is a space to be crossed. and that the most important thing is to find the shortest, fastest, most efficient route. But in ancient thought, that is not how people questioned their world. A map then did not revolve around where to go. It revolved around how to remain. It was not created to push people farther outward, but to keep them from going too far from the points that had once guaranteed life. So, instead of asking how to travel from one place to another, ancient thinking centered on three questions slower, heavier, and far more clearly tied to survival. They asked, which places keep the community alive? Not the places that were largest or richest, but the places that had proven across many seasons that people could survive there when nature shifted its rhythm. They asked next, which places connect human beings to a larger order? Not in an abstract sense, but in a very concrete one. Places where ritual was performed, where law was proclaimed, where the world seemed to return to its familiar state after chaos. And finally, they asked a question more silent than all the others. Which places must be remembered correctly, named correctly, and repeated? Because in a world where personal memory was fragile and writing was still rare, forgetting a place wrongly could lead to consequences that could not be reversed. Those questions do not draw a route. They do not lead to a journey. They lead to functional places. A place was not remembered because of where it sat on the surface of the earth, but because if it was forgotten, its role forgotten, its position. In order forgotten, the familiar world might begin to slip out of rhythm slowly but inevitably. And from those questions, an ancient map took shape, not as a drawing, but as a structure of memory, carried from one generation to the next, so the world could continue to remain in the right place. The map as a chain of anchoring points. In a world without hand-drawn maps, without fixed symbols to point the way, people were forced to find another method to avoid being lost within the very place they lived. They needed anchors, not points marked on paper, but points solid enough not to drift away with the changing landscape, points that could be returned to in memory, even when the river had changed course, when the land had thinned and faded, when the generations that once remembered clearly had gradually disappeared. An anchor point did not need to be motionless geographically. It needed to stand firm in collective memory. A bend in the river, for example, was not remembered for how long it was, or which direction it curved. It was remembered because in most of the community's shared memory, its waters had once risen in the right season enough to feed the fields, but not so early that they swept everything away. That memory repeated across generations turned the river into an anchor, not because water never changed, but because people had learned how to read its rhythm. A stretch of higher ground was not remembered for its exact elevation or the shape of its surface. It was remembered because in years of violent flooding, when water erased familiar boundaries, that place had once kept the community from vanishing. When everything else was drowned beneath water, that high ground became evidence that there was still somewhere human beings could stand, could breathe, and could wait for the world to settle again. And then there were anchor points not directly tied to physical survival, yet no less important. A temple, for example, was not remembered because its architecture was elaborate or monumental. It was remembered because their ritual had been performed in moments when the world seemed to lose balance. There people gathered. They spoke the names that needed to be spoken. They repeated familiar actions to reassure themselves that order might still return. When the ritual ended, no one could be certain the disaster would stop, or that the next season would be kinder. But the fact that the ritual had been performed was enough to turn that place into a spiritual anchor, a place the community could return to whenever the world became too unpredictable. Places like these over time ceased to be mere locations. They became anchors of order. And when those anchors were named in texts, in rituals, in prayers, they were not named to guide strangers. They were named to remind those who remained of something very simple yet vital, We survived when we remembered these places correctly, and in a world always standing close to the edge of chaos, that memory anchored in familiar places is what kept the world from drifting away completely. A map written through repetition. In modern thinking, repetition is often seen as redundant. But in ancient thinking, repetition was the only way to ensure memory did not vanish. A place name was repeated, not because of a lack of creativity, but because it had been tested across generations and proved that it preserved order. An ancient map, therefore, was not drawn once and then completed. It was repeated again and again in ritual, in texts, in prayers, in lists of gods, in passages that seemed dry. Each repetition was a reinforcement. A place name never stands alone. A modern map allows us to see each location as an independent point. Each place is defined by its own coordinates, outlined by clear borders, and can be understood without knowing what lies around it. But in ancient thought, no place exists alone. A place name is never understood as an isolated point. It only has meaning when placed in relationship to other places. Ancient people did not view the world as a flat surface that can be divided. They viewed it as a system in which every part is linked, and every change in one place can spread to another. So each place name was always remembered within a specific chain of relationships. This place is higher than that place, which means when water rises, this place becomes refuge, and that place may become dangerous. This place is closer to water than that place which does not speak only of convenience, but of risk. To be close to water is to be close to life, but also close to loss. This place is a ritual center where people gather name order and try to bring the world back to its familiar rhythm. That place is the edge of safety, not because it is more important, but because it is used when everything else becomes too unstable. There are places seen as protected, considered to lie within the zone where order has been confirmed. And there are places that must be watched not because they are evil, but because the community's history has remembered that risk once began there. Those relationships do not appear on a flat picture. They cannot be compressed into lines and symbols. So the map does not exist as an image. It exists as a network of survival relationships, a structure in which each place has meaning only when placed in its correct position within the whole system. And a network like that cannot be fully preserved on paper or stone. It can only exist in collective memory, passed down through storytelling, through ritual, through naming the right place at the right moment. Only when those relationships are remembered together does the familiar world continue to hold its shape, not on a map, but in how people live with it each day. Why a map had to be tied to the divine. In the modern world, a map can exist without belief. But in the ancient world, a map without authority would not be trusted. And the highest authority did not come from human beings, but from an order believed to stand above human beings. That is why these maps made of place names were always tied to the gods. Not because the gods drew the map, but because tying place names to divinity allowed the community to believe. These places are not only important to us, they are also correct within the order of the world. Anunnaki in this context is not a guide. They are the guarantor of the map. The map was not meant for exploration, but for stability. Another crucial difference lies in the deeper purpose a map was created to serve. A modern map encourages exploration. It assumes the world is an open space, that there are always unknown regions ahead, waiting to be discovered, measured, named. A map like that expands vision. It invites people to move farther from what is familiar to cross boundaries and to turn the unknown into the defined. But an ancient map was born from an entirely different logic. It does not invite exploration, it warns. In the ancient world, going too far was not an opportunity, but a risk, because every step away from remembered anchors was a step into a region where order was no longer guaranteed. To explore too far meant placing oneself into conditions that had never been tested. And in a world where small mistakes could accumulate into catastrophe, that was a cost not every community could accept. More dangerous than going far was forgetting the way back. to forget familiar anchors, the bends of river that once fed the fields, the high ground that once saved people in flood, the places where ritual had once been performed to reassure the community was to lose the ability to bring the world back to a stable state when it began to slip out of rhythm. So the ancient map was not created to expand the world. It was created to anchor the world. It identified points tested by time places the community knew it could live, could return to, could rely on when everything else became unpredictable. In that sense, the ancient map does not say, go farther. It says slowly and cautiously, here is where we know how to live. Here is where order once stood firm. Beyond these points, the world still exists, but our order is no longer certain. And in a world always standing close to chaos, knowing where to stay is sometimes far more important than knowing how far you can go. When the map becomes collective memory, over time the map no longer exists as a set of information. It becomes memory, a shared memory, reinforced by ritual, confirmed by law, repeated in texts. One person can forget, one generation can drift. But when the map is distributed across many forms, the probability of it disappearing drops dramatically. That is why we see the same place names repeating across hundreds of different texts, not because they are geographically important, but because they are performing the work of a map, preparing for what comes next. When we understand that a map in ancient thought is not a drawing, but a structure of memory, one thing becomes clearer. The place names tied to Anunnaki do not need to be precisely located on a modern map. They need to be correct in function. They must appear where order is confirmed, where power is legitimized, where the world is brought back to its familiar position. And that is why in the next chapter we will not ask, where are these place names on Earth? We will ask another question, one far more important. Why are these names spoken at exactly those moments and nowhere else? That question will lead us to the most suspiciously repeated place names in all of ancient writing. When we begin to read enough ancient cuneiform texts spanning many centuries and many different contexts, one phenomenon gradually emerges, not like a sudden discovery, but like a slow burning feeling that becomes clearer and clearer. It does not arrive in a single so that's it moment, but through the quiet accumulation of small details, repetitions that seem accidental until the reader can no longer treat them as coincidence. These texts were not written to tell stories. Most of them are dry, fragmented, sometimes nothing more than lists, instructions, short prayers, or administrative passages devoid of any emotional color. The script is pressed deep into clay while it is still wet in steady, hard, wedge-shaped strokes, leaving no room for looseness or improvisation. Every sign has a cost. Every line is weighed because errors are not easily corrected and material is not always available. It is precisely within that restraint that repetition becomes noticeable. Not repetition of plot or imagery, but the persistent return of certain names. Those names appear in legal texts where social order is framed by words. They appear in religious rituals where people try to call the right things by the right names so the world will not slip out of rhythm. They are present in lists of deities, arranged carefully, neither too much nor too little. And they even seep into administrative records that seem concerned only with taxes, land, or the distribution of grain. In every context, these names are not explained again. There are no annotations, no introductions. The writer seems to assume that anyone reading this text already knows what they are, and more importantly, knows why they must appear here. They are written with a consistency that is astonishing despite the span of time between texts. There are no creative variants, no linguistic experiments. The names are preserved intact, as if changing even a small detail could tilt the meaning the community is trying to protect. And they always appear in familiar positions within the structure of the text, like fixed points the scribe returns to whenever it is necessary to confirm that this order is legitimate. More importantly, they appear at sensitive moments, when law is proclaimed, when power is transferred, when ritual must calm a community after instability, when people face the feeling that the world around them is becoming unpredictable. In such moments, naming correctly is not a formal gesture. It is an act of stabilization. In a culture where writing is still rare and every sign requires effort, such repetition cannot be accidental. It is not the result of mechanical habit, and even less of a lack of imagination. It is a deliberate choice, a decision repeated across generations by different people, yet sharing the same sense that there are names that must not be forgotten, must not be altered, and must not be placed in the wrong position. That controlled repetition opens another approach to what we call a map in ancient thought. A map not drawn with lines or proportions, but made of memory, compressed into names. A map that does not guide people farther outward, but reminds them to remember correctly the points that once kept the world standing. And if we read these texts long enough, we begin to realize that what matters is not where these names point, but when they are invoked and under what conditions, because that is where the true map of the ancient world begins to reveal its shape. The place names associated with the Anunnaki were not used to answer the question, "Where is this place?" but to answer another question far deeper. What task does this place perform within the structure of the world? Therefore, when a place name appears repeatedly, it does not mean it is a geographic center. It means it is an indispensable point within the community's structure of memory and ritual. A place may vanish from the physical surface of the world, but if it is still named with the correct function, its role continues to exist within the spiritual order people hold on to in order to survive. One such name is Ikur. In many modern translations, Ikur is often understood simply as a temple, but ancient texts never describe Ikur as a specific architectural structure with precise dimensions, a fixed shape, or an exact location. Instead, Ikur is called the House of the Mountain. In ancient thought, a mountain is not merely a landform, but a symbol of stability. A mountain rises above flood-prone ground. It does not drift with water, and it does not change as quickly as the plains. To call a space the House of the Mountain is not to say it sits on a mountain. It is to assert that here order has a foundation. Each time Ikur is named in a text, what is activated is not an image of a particular site, but the idea that order is being placed upon a firm support. Because it carries that function, Ikur can appear in many texts at many different times without needing to move. It does not move because it was never a coordinate point to begin with. Another name that appears with striking frequency is Abzu. In many modern interpretations, Abzu is often treated as an ocean or a physical body of water, but ancient texts do not support that reading. Abzu has no shore, no direction, no boundary. It is mentioned as the source of water, not a specific water, but the principle of water. In the Sumerian world, water is both the condition of existence and a constant threat. It feeds fields, but it can also erase the traces of human life in a single flood season. Abzu, therefore, is not a place people go to. It is something people must remember without ever being able to control it. When Abzu is invoked in ritual, it is not meant to describe a location, but to acknowledge that the order people live within rests on a foundation deeper than their ability to command. The repetition of Abzu is not meant to plant fear. It is meant to maintain a necessary humility before nature and before the fragility of the world itself. Perhaps the most clearly symbolic name in the entire system of place terms connected to the Anunnaki is Duranki, often translated as the bond between heaven and earth. Even in that translation, it is clear this is not a location in the ordinary sense. A bond is not something you stand on, and between heaven and earth is not a space you can measure. Duranki, from the beginning, stands outside the logic of physical mapping. No text describes the route to Duranki. There are no instructions for reaching it, no notes on distance or direction. It is not placed within a specific terrain, nor anchored to a natural landmark that can be easily recognized. This is not a failure of the writer. It is evidence that Duranki was never understood as a place one finds by walking. Instead, Duranki appears at very particular moments in ancient writing. It is invoked when power is transferred, when a king must be affirmed as legitimate, not only in the eyes of people, but within a larger order of the world. It is mentioned in central rituals when the community gathers to repeat familiar actions, reassuring itself that the world is still operating within a structure that can be understood. And it appears especially in times of instability, when people need to believe that the connection between layers of reality, between sky, earth, and social life, has not been severed. In those contexts, Duranki functions not as a place, but as a condition. It is the name for the moment when heaven and earth are understood to remain bound to still be in contact. Not in the sense of dialogue, but in the sense that the order above still relates to the order below. And what is unfolding within human society has not been completely cut off from the structure of the cosmos. Duranki therefore does not exist in physical space, but in conceptual space. It lives in the way people think about the world, in the belief that the world is not merely a chain of random events, but a system with order. Fragile, yes, but still maintainable if one names its foundational principles correctly. To invoke Duranki is not to point out where we are, but to affirm we are still connected to something larger than ourselves. Because it carries that function, Duranki can appear again and again without changing form. Each time it is invoked, there is no new information, no long explanation. But the repetition itself is enough to activate a familiar feeling that the tether between heaven and earth still exists, even if no one can see it or touch it. In a world always standing at the edge of chaos, where floods, drought, and social upheaval can break everything quickly, faith in such a tether is not a luxury. It is a condition for continuing to live. The persistent presence of Duranki in ancient texts shows that the Sumerians and cultures that followed did not seek to locate themselves in the universe in a spatial sense. They did not ask where they stood among the stars. What mattered far more was whether the connection between the layers of the world was still being maintained. And Duranki as a name spoken at the right time in the right place within ritual and text is how they answered that question quietly without display, but with enough force to keep order believable as something that still exists. When we place these three names side by side, Ekurabzu Duranki, a structure begins to appear. They do not represent specific locations, but foundational conditions that allow order to exist, a stable support, a deep resource beyond control, and a bond between layers of reality. Any place name that does not perform one of these roles does not need to be repeated. The repetition, therefore, is not excess. It is a reinforcement of collective memory. Each time a place name is spoken, it reactivates part of the mental map the community relies upon to continue. If a modern map is a flat surface where every location can be separated, measured, and seen at once, then the ancient map has an entirely different shape. It does not unfold before the eyes as a total image. It exists as a network of nodes points remembered, not because of where they are, but because they prevent the world from coming apart. In that network, each repeated place name functions as a memory node, something the mind can return to when familiar signs begin to blur, when harvests become erratic, when water fails to arrive on time, when law is challenged, when people feel that an order once believed self-evident has become more fragile than ever. These memory nodes do not need to be linked by roads. They are linked by memory, by ritual, by names repeated across generations. People do not need to know where they are within the vast space of the world. They do not need to know how far they have traveled from an origin point. What they need is the ability to return, not by foot, but by recognition that there are still familiar points that give the world a shape. In moments of instability, naming a place correctly is not descriptive. It is an act of affirmation. To name correctly is to acknowledge the correct function. And to name at the correct time is to place that node back into its rightful position within the shared order. When that happens, order, though, unseen though immeasurable, can be felt as present again. That feeling does not come from physical evidence, but from reactivated familiarity, the sense that the world has stood before under similar conditions. That these names have been invoked in the past, and at that time, the community did not disappear. In a world where everything can change after a single season, the memory of having survived before carries a special weight. This is why repeated place names do not merely mark space. They mark the capacity to continue living. They are points a community can hold on to maintain its own continuity, even as external conditions become unpredictable. A place name invoked at the right moment may not stop the rain or make waters retreat faster, but it helps people believe that there is still a deeper structure holding the world in place. Within that network, there is no absolute center and no fixed edge. What matters is not the position of each node, but whether the nodes are still remembered and still connected within collective memory. If one essential node is forgotten, the entire network can weaken. And if the nodes continue to be invoked correctly, the world, fragile as it is, can still be felt as operating. In this way, the ancient map is not a tool for discovering the world. It is a tool for keeping the world. Not keeping it in space, but keeping it in meaning. And in a culture living close to the edge of collapse, the ability to keep the world meaningful is what makes the difference between continuing to exist and disappearing. Seen in this light, it becomes clear that these repeated place names do not need to be found on a modern map. They need to be placed correctly within the structure of ancient thought. And from here, the important question is no longer where these place names are located, but what axis they are placed upon between river, mountain, and sky so the world does not slide apart. That question will lead us deeper into a place where space ritual and power merge into a single structure, where the Anunnaki map truly exists, not on earth or stone, but in the collective memory of human beings. As the repeated place names gradually reveal themselves as memory nodes of order, a deeper question begins to form, not to locate them on a modern map, but to understand along what axis they are placed within ancient thought. Because if those names are not meant to give directions, not meant to measure distance, then some other structure must be holding them together. And that structure does not spread outward along the horizontal plane of space. It rises along a vertical line of meaning, an axis of the world where what human beings can touch, what they can only rely on, and what they can only look up toward are arranged in a durable relationship. In the world of Sumer, that axis is not a straight line drawn to be seen, but a rhythm of operation felt day by day, season by season, each time a person steps outside and looks toward the horizon. It does not exist as a diagram, but as a habit of recognition. a way of understanding that the world stands only when its different layers remain bound together. That axis begins at the river, passes through the mountain, and ends in the sky, not as three separate terrains, but as three layers of a single reality where each layer holds a function that cannot be replaced in maintaining order. The river is the beginning point, because the river is what people must face first every day and without avoidance. In the land between the two waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the river does not merely carry water, it carries time. Time is not counted in hours or days, but in water levels rising and falling in sandbanks, widening or narrowing in small signs on the ground that reveal which way the world is leaning. Each flood season is a question posed again. Each season of retreat is a temporary answer. The river feeds the fields, but it can also erase every trace in a single season of flood. It carries silt and promise, but it also carries the threat of loss. And so the river is both the condition of life and the boundary of control. People cannot command the river. They cannot force it to flow according to their will. The only thing they can do is learn how to read the water level to know when to open canals, read the banks to know when to step back, read the smallest signs to decide when to plant and when to wait. That reading of the river is not abstract knowledge. It is a survival skill accumulated across generations. It demands continuous attention, patience, and acceptance that some factors will always remain out of reach. On the world axis, the river is the lowest layer, not because it is less important, but because it is where people come into most direct contact with uncertainty. Their order is not yet anchored, not yet guaranteed. It is only tested. And because the river is where uncertainty operates most visibly, it forces people to seek other layers to balance it. From the river, the world axis turns upward toward what does not drift with water, toward what can hold the rhythm of social life when the current becomes too strong. Yet no matter how far that axis rises, it always begins with the river, because the river is a constant reminder that order is not self-evident. It must be read, learned, and placed within a larger structure in order to exist. In that sense, the river is not merely a natural element on the world axis. It is the first test of order. If people cannot read the river, they cannot build the layers that come after. And if the river is forgotten, the world axis loses its starting point, loses the place that reminds us that every stability is built upon a foundation of uncertainty. But the river cannot produce order by itself. A world with only a river would be a world that drifts. And so, ancient thought requires another support, something that does not drift. That is the mountain. The mountain does not need to be densely present in the geography of Mesopotamia. What matters is the idea of the mountain. The mountain represents stability, what rises above flood-prone ground, what does not change quickly with the seasons. In ritual and text, that idea crystallizes into spaces such as Ekur, the house of the mountain, not to point to a particular peak, but to affirm that order requires a foundation that does not drift with water. On the world axis, the mountain is the anchoring layer, the place where the river is subdued, not by force, but by placing it within a steadier frame. Between river and mountain, people begin to imagine their social space not as an area outlined on a map, but as a life and death buffer zone between two opposing forces. On one side is the ever-changing flow of water, where uncertainty reveals itself most clearly. On the other side is the idea of stability, where order can be anchored. Social space does not fully belong to either side. It exists precisely in the tension between them. A city, therefore, is not built just anywhere. It cannot sit too close to the river where everything can be carried away after a single high season. But it also cannot detach itself completely from water, because water is the condition of survival. The city is placed where the river can be read, where its rhythm can be understood, its movement partly anticipated, and at the same time where one can lean on the mountain, even if only by idea, by structures that function as stability, by spaces regarded as not drifting with the current of time. Within that space, social life begins to take shape. Laws are established not to conquer nature, but to negotiate with it. Land is divided not only by need, but by the environment's capacity to endure. Water is channeled not to control it completely, but to reduce risk when it rises beyond familiar thresholds. Every decision bears the mark of caution, because the community understands it lives between forces that cannot be erased. At the center of that social space is ritual. Ritual is not a side element of life. It is an operating mechanism that allows the community to face what cannot be solved by tools or commands. When ritual is performed, people reaffirm that water will be guided according to what has been learned, that land will be divided according to patterns that once allowed survival, and that risks, though impossible to eliminate, can still be placed within a shared order. Naming within ritual carries a particular meaning. Naming does not stop water. It does not prevent floods, and it does not shorten the dry season. But it gives fear a shape. A fear that is named is no longer a vague threat. It becomes an acknowledged part of the world, an element with a place inside the larger structure. When fear has a name, the community can face it together instead of being dissolved by it from within. In that way, the river-mountain axis is not a diagram of terrain, but a framework of thought. It allows people to place risk inside order without needing to remove risk itself. It does not promise absolute safety. It promises something far more realistic, the ability to live with uncertainty without letting uncertainty break the entire fabric of social life. The social space formed between river and mountain, therefore, is not merely where people live. It is where they learn how to exist as a community. Their order is not something handed down from above. It is the result of continuously reading, adjusting, and naming correctly the forces operating around them. And within that intermediate space, the world axis becomes alive, not as an abstract concept, but as a familiar breath of everyday life. But that order is still incomplete without the third layer, the sky. The sky is what people cannot touch, cannot control, but can observe. In a world without artificial light, the sky is a clock, a calendar, a repetition of rhythm that makes people believe there are things more stable than the ground itself. The cycles of stars, moon, and seasons create the feeling that above the river's uncertainty and the mountain's relative stability, there is still another layer of order, farther more encompassing and less altered by human mistake. Here, the world axis closes the river below, where risk operates, the mountain in the middle, where order is anchored, and the sky above, where order is guaranteed. People live within the middle of that axis, not as conquerors, but as keepers of rhythm. They do not make the river gentler, but learn to live by its rhythm. They do not create the mountain, but build spaces that carry the mountain's function. They cannot touch the sky, but read its signs in order to believe that a larger frame still surrounds the world. Within this axis, names like Ekur Abzu and Dur Anki do not stand scattered. They sit in their proper places. Abzu belongs to the layer of deep water, the place where survival resources exist outside control. Ekur belongs to the layer of stability, the place where order is given a foundation. Duranki belongs to the point of connection where sky and earth are understood to remain in contact. The repetition of these place names in texts is not meant to describe geography, but to reactivate the axis whenever order risks slipping out of rhythm. What is striking is that this world axis does not operate through command, but through repeated ritual. When water rises unexpectedly, rituals invoking principles tied to the river are performed. When power must be legitimized, spaces carrying the function of the mountain are named. When society needs reassurance that the world is still enclosed, the names tied to the sky and the point of connection are spoken. Each time the axis is not drawn, it is felt, and that feeling is what allows the community to continue living in a world that has never been certain. The river-mountain-sky axis also explains why the ancient map does not expand without limit. Beyond the river is risk. Away from the anchor is instability. And the sky, though always present, is not a place to go. This axis anchors the world by reminding people that some limits are not meant to be crossed, but meant to place oneself correctly. In that correct place, people can live, remember, and pass memory on to the next generation. When we look at the world axis this way, we begin to understand why repeated place names do not need coordinates. They need function. They must be invoked at the right time so the axis does not break. A society may change, a city may shift a riverbank, may alter its shape, but if the axis can still be reactivated through ritual and memory, the familiar world still keeps its shape within the community's mind. And precisely because that axis is a structure of memory more than of space, it can endure across centuries, surviving changes of dynasty, of city, and even of natural landscape. Memory does not need massive stone foundations or detailed maps to exist. It only needs to be repeated with enough accuracy, enough persistence, and at the right moments. In that sense, the world axis stands not by material, but by human fidelity to what has been learned through survival experience. Different hands carving the same signs into clay do so not because they lack creativity, and not because they are simply copying the past. They do so because each familiar sign is a joint, a hinge, that keeps the entire structure from snapping. Each time a sign is carved again, it is an act of reactivating the world axis, not through image, but through recognition that this world was once understood in this way, and that this understanding once helped people endure. Keeping the river readable is not only watching water level or current. It is maintaining the capacity to listen to small signs of uncertainty. To read the river is not to forget that time can rise suddenly, that life always comes with risk, and that every plan must leave room for what cannot be predicted. When the memory of how to read the river is lost, the world axis loses its first layer, its reminder that order always begins with acknowledging uncertainty. Keeping the mountain anchored is not protecting a specific terrain. It is maintaining spaces and principles that carry the function of stability. The mountain on the world axis symbolizes what does not drift with the current of change. When people continue to name places that carry the function of mountain, they are affirming that society needs supports, standards, rituals, and power structures believed to be strong enough to resist dissolution. Lose this layer, and order has nowhere to stop. And keeping the sky believable as an enclosing presence is not naivete. It is recognition that there are layers of order beyond direct human intervention. To trust the sky does not mean believing everything will always be fine. It means believing the world is not pure chaos, that there are still cycles, repetitions, rhythms stable enough to lean on when everything on the ground becomes too fragile. That belief allows people to lift their heads not to escape reality, but to place their reality inside a larger frame. In a world where nature can break every plan within a single season, keeping the world axis is not blind faith. It is a survival skill sharpened across generations, knowing what must be remembered, what must be repeated, and what must not be forgotten. It allows people to live not in the illusion of control, but in a fragile balance between acceptance and preparation. In that way, the world axis is not merely a cosmological idea. It is a practical inheritance, a method of survival transmitted not through books, but through signs, ritual, and the habit of naming. When those signs continue to be pressed into clay, the axis is not only remembered, it is kept alive. And as long as that axis remains alive in collective memory, the world, though always standing before the possibility of collapse, can still be felt as being in its proper place. As this chapter closes, what remains is not the image of a new map, but the feeling of an old structure so old it does not need to be drawn. A world axis that ancient people lived with, named correctly, and passed on as part of collective memory. In the next chapter, we will look at ritual not as acts of belief alone, but as an operating mechanism that allows the river-mountain-sky axis to continue being activated, so the world, fragile as it is, can remain in the right place. When we look back across everything that appears in the ancient texts, a question that seems simple at first begins to feel unavoidable. Why must those place names repeat? Why, in a world where writing is still rare, materials are still precious, and every sign requires labor, do people choose to return to the same set of names, writing them again in the same form, placing them in the same positions within ritual and lost century after century? If the goal were merely to describe space, that repetition would be excessive. But if the goal is to keep the world from slipping out of its familiar shape, then that repetition becomes mandatory. In modern thinking, repetition is often treated as a lack of creativity, a sign of mechanical habit. But in ancient thinking, repetition is the only way to preserve meaning. Something spoken once can be forgotten. Something spoken again correctly in the right place becomes part of the structure of collective memory. A place name, therefore, is not repeated to emphasize beauty or grandeur, but to keep its function from fading over time. For people living in the world of Sumer, where everything could change after a single season, the most dangerous thing was not change itself. Change was familiar. Water could rise, soil could crack, seasons could fall out of rhythm. Harsh as those realities were, they still belonged to the range of lived experience. What was truly terrifying was disorientation. Not disorientation in space, not getting lost in desert or plain, but disorientation in order no longer knowing what is holding this world upright. When water rises unexpectedly, when harvests fail, when power is challenged or becomes untrustworthy, the first question is not, where will we go, but what can we still rely on? Because going anywhere is meaningless if there is no foundation on which to place the next step. In such moments, people do not seek new solutions, something inventive, something unprecedented. They seek an anchor, something that existed before the crisis, something tested in previous instability, something that once kept the community from dissolving. That is why the answer cannot be newly invented each time a crisis appears. A new answer unproven would only increase uncertainty. What must be invoked has to be something already present in collective memory, familiar enough to require no explanation, durable enough to stand even when everything around it is changing. It must have existed before. It must have been repeated enough times to become self-evident. And it must be remembered deeply enough to rise almost as reflex when order is threatened. It is in this context that place names begin to move beyond their role as points in space and become stable markers of memory. A place name no longer says only here, but this has stood before. It carries the trace of crises survived, of moments when the world nearly slipped out of its familiar rhythm, but was pulled back. When a name is spoken, the community remembers not only a place, but the function that place once performed in keeping order intact. But memory, if not repeated, quietly disintegrates. Not through a single obvious collapse, but through gradual fading when small details are forgotten, when roles are no longer named, when the name becomes hollow. Individuals can die. Generations can change. Cities can shift location or vanish entirely. But if those names continue to be invoked correctly at the right moment, then the role they represent remains alive. They exist not in stone or soil, but in deliberate repetition. Repetition, therefore, is not the act of preserving the past like a motionless exhibit. It is a way of pulling the past into the present whenever order needs to be reaffirmed. Each time a place name is repeated in ritual in law or in moments of instability, it is a moment when the past is activated not for nostalgia, but to do work. In that sense, the past becomes a survival tool, allowing a community to keep its orientation in a world that never stands still. And it is precisely through that repetition that Sumerian people could live with the feeling that even if everything around them changes, order can still be found again, not by inventing something new, but by remembering the old correctly. A place name spoken correctly does not only confirm a location, it confirms a way the world operates. When a ritual repeats the same name that was spoken in similar times before, the community is not only recalling history, it is recalling that they have faced comparable risks and did not disappear. That memory does not require detail. It requires continuity, and continuity can only be guaranteed through repetition. Repetition also plays another role more subtle and visible only when we look at that world across the span of many generations. It creates a shared language that moves through time, a language that does not need to be retaught from the beginning each time society changes. When people who do not know one another, separated by many generations, who have not even shared the same direct experience, can still understand the same name in the same way that shows the name has moved beyond the level of mere information and become a norm. And a norm differs from information in one crucial way: it does not require agreement each time it is used. It does not need to be debated or defended with argument. A norm is understood because it has been repeated for long enough to become self-evident, so self-evident that it is no longer questioned. And it is precisely that self-evidence that allows a society to function smoothly in unstable times, when every attempt to explain or renegotiate foundations would only increase tension. In a world where upheaval is unavoidable, having to renegotiate every foundation each time a crisis arrives would cause society to grind itself down. The repetition of place names therefore functions as a friction reduction mechanism. It allows people to rely on what is implicitly understood, saving energy for confronting new risks as they arise. When a name is spoken and instantly understood, the community can act without pausing to ask, "Is this still true?" That is why in ancient texts we rarely see long explanations for familiar place names. Not because the scribe was careless, and not because they assumed everything was obvious. On the contrary, avoiding explanation is a deliberate choice. Because the moment order must be explained, it has already begun to lose its power. An order that needs justification is an order no longer fully trusted. So instead of explaining the texts, choose repetition. The name is placed in the correct position within ritual, within law, within moments when the legitimacy of an action or a power must be confirmed. Familiarity does the work. It generates the sense of continuity that what is happening is not an arbitrary decision of the present, but the continuation of a pattern that existed before. A place name repeated correctly does not need to persuade. It confirms. It says this has stood before, this has been accepted before, and therefore this can continue to operate. In times when everything else is suspect, harvest weather authority, that confirming power, becomes immensely valuable. It allows society to keep moving without having to stop and question the ground beneath its own feet. In that way, repetition does not impoverish thought. It makes thought durable. It creates a layer of implicit understanding that one generation can hand to the next without lengthy explanations. And that layer of implicit understanding is what carries a community through time, not by remembering every detail, but by holding on to names strong enough to keep orienting order when the world becomes unpredictable. That repetition also allows place names to exceed the limits of physical space. A place can be destroyed, abandoned, or altered beyond recognition, yet its name, if it continues to be repeated, still retains its function. This is especially important in a land where rivers can change course, sandbanks can vanish, and familiar landmarks can no longer be trusted. When space itself is unstable, only well-organized memory can keep the world from dissolving. At a deeper level, repetition of place names is also a form of training collective memory. Each new generation does not learn the world from scratch. They learn by stepping into an existing structure where familiar names function as supports. When a child hears the same place, name spoken in multiple contexts, ritual law stories of the past, that child does not learn only a name, but a role. They learn that some places must not be forgotten, because forgetting them means losing the ability to understand how the world is operating. Repetition, therefore, is not an aesthetic choice. It is a cognitive strategy. It reduces the burden on individual memory by placing responsibility on collective memory. No one needs to remember the entire order. It is enough to remember the correct names at the correct moments, because that is enough to activate the entire structure behind them. A place name repeated correctly is like a key. It does not carry the whole room, but it opens the door into it. This also explains why not every place name is repeated. Only those tied to foundational functions, reading the river, anchoring stability, connecting layers of reality, require that kind of persistence. Places that serve temporary needs can disappear without shaking order. But places that function as pillars, if they are not repeated, leave a void nothing can replace. That selection is not made by theory, but by survival experience across generations. In that context, the repeated appearance of place names linked with the Anunnaki is not the trace of a complex mythological system meant to be decoded in the modern sense, layered symbols stacked with secret meanings waiting to be unlocked. That kind of reading reflects a modern need, an era accustomed to treating knowledge as something to be peeled apart, analyzed, and rebuilt in new conceptual frameworks. But for ancient people, especially in the world of Sumer, the aim was not to explain the world to completion. The aim was to keep the world operational. Those place names set beside the Anunnaki do not form an exciting narrative about cosmic origins. They form a memory system, a structure simple enough to be transmitted, stable enough not to be distorted by time, and precise enough to be activated in moments of instability. That system was not designed to satisfy curiosity. It was designed to withstand the pressure of a world always capable of collapse. The retained names are not kept because they are mysterious, but because they work. They were spoken in crucial moments when power needed legitimacy, when ritual needed to re-establish order, when the community faced risks beyond direct control. Each time they were spoken correctly in the right place, they proved they could still do what they were preserved to do. And in a system of survival, that is the most important criterion. The working here is not action in a personalized sense. The Anunnaki do not intervene. do not strike, do not change fate in the way modern stories often expect. Instead, linking place names to the Anunnaki generates a legal frame for order, a sense that what is being done is not merely a temporary human decision, but part of a structure already accepted. When that frame is activated, society can keep functioning without falling into total doubt. This suggests the Anunnaki do not need to be understood as a cast of characters, but as a function of memory. They allow the community to remember not the details of the past, but the ways the world was kept standing. And place names acting as anchors are where that function is activated most effectively. A name spoken does not only point to a place, it points to an entire chain of practices, rituals, and decisions once attached to that place. In that way, repetition does not make the system rigid. On the contrary, it makes it flexible in the right way. Because when order already contains points of return, society can adapt to change without losing orientation. It does not need to reinvent its foundation with every crisis. It only needs to speak the right name and let the structure behind that name begin to operate. So, when we look at place names linked to the Anunnaki and see them repeating with such durability, what we are witnessing is not the residue of vague belief, but the trace of an ancient memory technology, a technology not built on durable materials or detailed maps, but built on the precise repetition of names and functions. It does not promise absolute safety, but it provides something far more important, the ability to summon order at the right time, when everything else is at risk of falling apart. And in a world where nature needs no reason to shatter every human plan, that ability, however simple, becomes one of the deepest foundations of survival. And finally, repetition carries an even deeper meaning. It allows people to live with the feeling that the world, fragile as it is, still possesses continuity. When familiar names continue to appear in texts, rituals, and laws, the community can believe it is not the first generation to face uncertainty and not the last. That belief does not erase risk, but it makes risk bearable. So when we ask why place names must repeat, the answer does not lie in geography, but in time. Place names repeat to build a bridge across time, linking different moments of instability into a single structure of meaning. Because of that bridge, people can move through crisis without losing their sense of order. And in a world where nature always holds the power to break every plan, the ability to preserve that sense is one of the basic conditions for a community to continue existing. In the next chapter, we will look at ritual not as acts of belief alone, but as a technical mechanism of memory where the repetition of place names, actions, and invocations comes together to operate the world axis once again, each time it is at risk of being forgotten. When we place the phrase mythic map beside geographic map, the natural reflex of the modern mind is to look for a difference in precision. One side is usually associated with symbol ambiguity, imagination, and stories that cannot be verified. The other is seen as scientific, measurable, objective, and therefore more reliable. This opposition is so familiar it becomes almost automatic. And yet that very familiarity hides the most important point. These two kinds of maps were not created to answer the same question. And when we force them to answer the same question, every comparison, no matter how sophisticated, leads to misunderstanding. The modern geographic map is built to serve a very specific need location. It answers the questions, where am I and how do I get from here to there? It tells us where a place lies in relation to other places, how far the distance between them is, and which direction one must take to arrive. In order to do this, the geographic map assumes that space is a reality that can be measured independently of human beings. that mountains, rivers, plains exist as neutral objects regardless of how people understand or feel them. In that logic, the value of a map lies in geometric accuracy, in scale, in the ability to reproduce physical reality in a stable and verifiable way. But the mythic map, especially in the world of Sumer, does not arise from that need. It is not meant to help people go farther faster or more precisely through space. It does not serve the expansion of territory or the optimization of travel. Instead, it is created to solve a different problem, quieter, but far more urgent: how not to become lost from order. In the ancient context, order is not an abstract coordinate system that can be drawn on paper. It is a fragile condition of the world, a condition in which water arrives in the right season. Land allows planting law is still respected, authority is still accepted, and ritual still has the power to soften the shared anxiety of a community. That order does not stand still. It is always at risk of falling out of rhythm after a single, abnormal season of water, a prolonged year of drought, or a social disruption that is not handled correctly. So the mythic map does not ask, "Where is this place?" It asks, "What role does this place perform in maintaining order?" It does not separate space from human beings. It binds space tightly to survival experience. A place name matters not because of its coordinates, but because of what has happened there. Rituals that were performed, decisions that were legitimized moments when the community felt the world being pulled back into its proper position. This difference makes it meaningless to compare the two kinds of maps by the criterion of accuracy. A geographic map can be extremely accurate in measurement, yet remain completely silent before the question, what keeps this society from falling apart? Conversely, a mythic map may not give us a single point to place onto a coordinate grid, yet it answers that question directly by identifying the points that must be remembered, must be named, and must be repeated when the world becomes unpredictable. In that sense, the mythic map is not a less scientific version of the geographic map. It is a different kind of tool created for a different kind of risk. When the greatest risk is not getting lost in space, but losing orientation in order, then, no matter how precise a measured map may be, it is not enough. What is needed is a map capable of keeping foundational relationships between water and land, between people, and law between the present and memory from breaking apart. And because it is born from that need, the mythic map does not attempt to describe the world as it is, but as it must operate if people are to continue living within it. That is why when we call those memory structures a map, we must temporarily set aside the familiar image of paper ink and neat lines laid flat before the eye. The mythic map is not designed to be looked at, much less to be carried in the hand. It exists in time more than in space. It does not lie still, waiting to be consulted. It appears only when needed, like a collective reflex, in moments when order is at risk of being shaken. That map is activated under very specific circumstances. When ritual takes place, ordinary space is temporarily transformed into meaningful space, where each action, each spoken name is tied to a role already defined in advance. When law is issued, the mythic map is present as an underlying foundation, confirming that the command is not merely human will, but belongs to a wider order already accepted. When power needs to be legitimized, familiar names are invoked, not to decorate the declaration, but to place that power into its proper position within a network that has existed for a long time. And especially when a community faces signs that the world is slipping out of rhythm, unpredictable harvests, water arriving at the wrong time, or social conflict, the mythic map is invoked again as a form of spiritual orientation. In all of these cases, the map does not answer the question, where do we go? It does not give directions. It does not open new paths. Instead, it reminds something more basic. What order are we in? When that question is answered, other questions what to do, whether to wait or act, can finally be asked in a meaningful way. Without orientation to order, every decision becomes arbitrary. This difference becomes even clearer when placed beside the geographic map. In a geographic map, each location exists as an independent entity. You can cut a point out of the whole zoom in to see detail zoom out to place it in wider context, and it still retains its basic meaning. The value of that point lies in its position within a shared coordinate system, where every point is defined by geometric relationship. But in the mythic map, no place name exists alone. Each name has meaning only when it sits within a network of relationships with other names. A river is not merely a river. It is where water brings time into life. A city is not merely a settlement. It is a junction where waterland and law meet. A temple is not merely a building. It is where ritual reaffirms order. And the sky is not merely a backdrop. It is the overarching layer where cycles are felt as stable. All of these elements are anchored to a shared axis of operation where meaning does not reside in isolated points, but in the links between them. If we pull a place name out of that network and ask, where is it that question misses the core? Because where is not what the mythic map aims to answer. The correct questions are, what does it connect to? And if it is lost, what in the order will be affected? In this logic, a place name that loses its connections becomes empty no matter how precisely its physical location is identified. In that way, the mythic map cannot be fragmented and still retain its meaning. It exists only as a living whole, activated when relationships are invoked simultaneously. And it is precisely this wholeness that allows it to do what the geographic map cannot. It helps a community not only know where it is, but know what order it stands within, a prerequisite for continuing to live in a world that always carries the risk of falling out of rhythm. This difference explains why many place names in ancient texts cannot be precisely located on modern maps. Not because ancient people lacked knowledge of space, but because space was not the primary unit of meaning. What was remembered was not coordinates, but function. A place was named because it held a certain role in maintaining order, reading the river, anchoring stability, connecting layers of reality, not because it lay at a particular point on Earth's surface. In a geographic map, precision is the highest value. A small error in distance or direction can lead to major confusion, even danger, because that map is made to guide movement through space, where every meter, every degree of deviation can change the outcome of a journey. There, correctness is measured by numbers, by scale, by the stable and repeatable reproduction of the physical world. A good map is one that yields the same answer no matter who uses it and no matter when. But in the mythic map, that standard no longer holds the center. Here, geometric precision matters less than right timing and right role. A place name works not because it is placed correctly on the ground, but because it is invoked at the correct moment, in the correct ritual, and in the correct context, where order needs to be reaffirmed. When those conditions converge, the place name performs its function, even if no one can point to it on a modern map, or even if its position has changed over time. Conversely, a place name might be located with great spatial accuracy, measured recorded, placed on correct coordinates. But if it is placed incorrectly in the ritual structure, given the wrong role within the network of order, then that accuracy becomes meaningless. It is like a perfect tool used for the wrong purpose. Not because the tool is inferior, but because it is not placed within the right operating system. It is here that we begin to understand why the mythic map does not encourage exploration in the modern sense. The geographic map opens the world. It invites human beings to go farther, to cross known limits, to seek regions not yet marked. In that logic, expanding space is synonymous with progress. Each new point added to the map is a step forward in knowledge, but the mythic map is the opposite. It anchors the world. It does not ask what remains unknown. It asks what must not be forgotten. It says that there are points which, if neglected, will leave order with nothing to hold to. Connections which, if severed, will cause the world to stop operating in its familiar way. Axes which, if broken, will make every other attempt at adaptation meaningless. In that context, curiosity is not placed first. To explore too far beyond points tested by time is not a sign of courage or creativity, but a risk. Not because the outer world is always dangerous, but because moving away from familiar anchors can cause people to lose their orientation within order. When they no longer know what keeps the world standing, every discovery becomes fragile. The mythic map, therefore, does not seek to broaden the horizon. It seeks to keep the horizon from collapsing. It accepts that the world may be vast, but only part of it is stable enough for people to live by. The rest, though it exists, does not need to be reached. What matters more is what has been named repeated and proven to sustain order across generations. In that way, the conservatism of the mythic map is not a refusal of progress, but a survival strategy. It prioritizes the durability of order over the expansion of space. And in the ancient world, where a small deviation in seasonal rhythm or river flow could shatter an entire community, that strategy was not the safe choice. It was the only choice. The mythic map does not oppose change, but it places change within a safe frame. When the world shifts, people do not search for new points on the map. They return to points repeated long enough to become norms. Those points do not merely locate space, they locate meaning. They tell the community what is central, what is peripheral, what must be protected, and what can be allowed to pass. Confusing the two kinds of maps often leads to distorted readings. When we try to locate mythic place names using the tools of modern geography, we accidentally impose criteria that do not fit. We ask, where is it, when the proper question should be, what role does it serve? And when we cannot find an answer to the first question, we easily fall into two extremes. Either we dismiss those place names as entirely fictional, or we push them into unnecessary supernatural hypotheses. But if we accept that the mythic map is a map of memory and order, everything becomes clearer. The repeated place names do not need to be proven by coordinates. They have already been proven by the fact that they continue to be used in key moments of social life. They exist not because they describe the world with precision, but because they help prevent the world from collapsing. In that sense, the mythic map does not compete with the geographic map. These two maps do not replace one another, nor do they deny one another. They operate on two different layers of human experience. One map helps people move through space. The other helps people stand firm in time. And in the ancient world, where time was often more dangerous than space, where a single season out of rhythm could destroy an entire community, the second kind of map was not only useful, but essential. When we understand this, we can read ancient texts without forcing them to answer questions they were never written to answer. Instead of asking, where are they, we ask, how do they hold this world in place? And within that question, the mythic map appears not as a vague drawing, but as a sophisticated cognitive tool, sharpened not to explore distant lands, but to ensure that people wherever they are and whenever they live can still find enough order to keep living. When the first Sumerian cuneiform texts were deciphered and stepped out of a narrow academic sphere, they did not merely carry knowledge of an ancient civilization. They entered a world very different from the one that had produced them, a world accustomed to precise maps to science fiction, to stories in which anything great must have an extraordinary origin and a spectacular explanation. It is precisely at that point of contact that the distance between ancient text and modern imagination began to open not through a sudden leap, but through very small deviations, almost unnoticeable at the beginning, yet accumulating over time. At first, that deviation was nearly harmless. Faced with repeated names with structures that did not follow the familiar narrative logic of biography, or epic modern people tend to fill the gaps with what they already know. This is a very natural cognitive instinct. When a text does not clearly state something, we do not accept its silence. We try to complete it using the most familiar patterns. If there is a name, we look for a character. If there is an action, we look for a motive. If there is order, we look for the one who designed that order. But the problem is not interpretation itself. Interpretation is unavoidable when two worlds of thought meet. The problem lies in the templates that get carried in templates formed in a world that has separated humans from nature, that has grown used to describing space through coordinates, time through precise calendars, and order through systems that can be designed, adjusted, and optimized. In that world, order is something produced by will and technique. And so, when modern thought encounters order in ancient texts, it immediately searches for the maker of that order. From this point onward, the Anunnaki are gradually pulled out of their original operational context and placed into stories the Sumerians never needed. When modern readers see a cluster of names repeated across many texts and many centuries, a mindset shaped by biography, by personalization, by questions of origin, begins to ask, who are they? Where did they come from? What did they do to deserve being mentioned again and again? Those questions make perfect sense in a novel, in later Greek mythology, or in history, written around central characters. But they are completely foreign to the way Sumerian texts operate, because the Anunnaki were not created to answer the question of who. They do not exist in order to have biographies, to develop personalities, or to become the main characters of a story. They exist to maintain a different question quieter, but far more fundamental, how this order can still stand. When a text invokes the Anunnaki, it does not invite the reader to follow a chain of events. It invites the community into a state in which law has force authority, has legitimacy, and the world is still felt to have structure. This difference is easy to miss because modern thought is used to treating texts as containers of information. But for the Sumerians, a text was not merely something to be read, but something to be activated. It was bound to ritual, to timing, to specific social space. A name carved into clay was not meant to tell a story from the past. It was meant to be spoken at the right moment to pull order back when it risked breaking apart. When we impose the question who onto texts written to answer how a drift in meaning becomes unavoidable, the Anunnaki begin to be understood as beings with origins, journeys, intentions, things the text never tried to provide. And when those elements cannot be found in the text, modern imagination continues to fill the gaps with hypotheses that drift ever farther from the original context. In that way, misunderstanding does not appear as an obvious error, but as a chain of small adjustments, each step seeming reasonable within a modern frame of reference. But the farther we go, the more we leave behind what the ancient texts are actually doing. They are not telling of extraordinary individuals. They are recording the anchors of order, what must be remembered, repeated, and named, so that the world, fragile as it is, can continue to function. And it is here that the distance between ancient text and modern imagination becomes clearest. not because the ancients lacked imagination, but because they used imagination for a different purpose, not to escape the world, but to keep this world from collapsing. The next drift comes from a distinctly modern habit of thought, equating description with physical entity. When an ancient text speaks of heaven-earth, a binding cord, a point of connection, a mind trained by space science and engineering immediately searches for a corresponding object. Heaven becomes a planet or outer space. The cord becomes a device, an energy axis, or a portal. The point of connection is read as a physical location that can be identified, measured, and even excavated. That reading does not arise from naivete, but from a deep assumption of the modern world that any description of value must be reducible to an object. In a culture where knowledge is proven through measurement machines and physical reproducibility concepts not anchored to objects can seem vague or incomplete. So when modern minds encounter powerful images in ancient texts, they automatically complete them by turning relationships into things. But in the ancient world, especially in Sumerian, thought those concepts are not meant to describe objects. They are meant to describe relationships in operation. Heaven is not a place to go. It is an overarching layer of stability. Earth is not merely a surface. It is where risk and survival intersect. The binding cord does not connect 2 points in space. It connects layers of reality so that order does not break. The point of connection is not a coordinate. It is the time and context in which that linkage is felt most strongly. These concepts do not point to places. They point to functions. They answer the question of what something does for order, not where it lies. When we read them as technical descriptions, we do not make the text more concrete. We make it poorer, because we strip away the relational layer of meaning, the layer that mattered most to the ancients. In that world, relationships mattered more than objects, because objects could change while relationships determined whether the world would continue to function. Alongside the reification of relationships, another far-reaching step in modern interpretation is the imposition of linear progress onto ancient thought. We live in a world that believes knowledge always moves forward, that each generation must surpass the previous one, and that if an ancient civilization achieved something complex, it must have possessed a secret we have since lost. From that assumption, the past becomes a storehouse of missing pieces, forgotten technologies, hidden knowledge, capabilities ahead of their time. But for the Sumerians, knowledge was not something meant to surpass the past. It was something meant to not forget the past. They did not measure the value of understanding by how new it was, but by how it had helped the community survive. Good knowledge was not knowledge that carried people farther. It was knowledge that kept them from slipping out of a tested order. In a world where a single season out of rhythm could destroy an entire way of life, holding on to what was known mattered far more than seeking what had never been tried. So when modern interpretation hunts for lost secrets, it accidentally misses what is central. No secret was lost at all. What the texts preserve is not time-transcending technology, but what proved capable of operating steadily across generations. The Sumerians were not trying to go beyond the order they knew. They were trying to resist the erosion of memory, an erosion quieter, yet more dangerous than any sudden catastrophe. When we impose linear progress onto ancient thought, we turn resilience into stagnation, repetition, into lack of creativity, and memory into a sign of regression. But in the ancient context, those very things were expressions of survival intelligence. They did not need to move fast. They needed to remain standing. And to remain standing in a world of constant change, what mattered most was not inventing the new, but remembering correctly what had once kept the world from collapsing. These two drifts in meaning, reifying relationships, and imposing linear progress, when combined, produce a distorted picture of the past, a picture in which the ancients are forced to resemble us more than they ever needed to. But when we step back, remove the demand for devices, planets, or lost secrets, the texts begin to appear as they truly are not messages sent to the future, but tools designed to keep the present from falling apart. When modern interpreters search for lost technology, they miss a basic truth. Ancient societies did not need superior technology to survive. They needed continuity. What is repeated in the texts is not the trace of missing machines, but the trace of what proved workable across generations. Turning the Anunnaki into cosmic engineers inadvertently obscures their real role, a system of mnemonic authority that allows society to maintain order without rebuilding it from scratch every time a crisis strikes. Another drift, subtler and even harder to notice, comes from separating text from ritual. In modern thought, a text is often understood as an independent object, something to read in silence, analyze, quote, and archive as information. But for ancient societies, especially in the world of Sumer, a text never existed that way. It was not written to lie still. It was written to be used. Ancient writing is bound to action. It accompanies spoken recitation gestures, ritual space, and specific moments in the community's cycle. A clay tablet incised with signs is not the end of meaning, but the ignition point. Only when placed into the right situation on the right day, in the right procedure, in the right position, do those signs truly work. Outside that context, they are only silent traces of a system that was once alive. When modern interpretation reads these texts as purely informational documents detached from their use context, what is lost is not a minor detail, but the operational key. Because ancient writing does not aim to describe the world in a neutral sense. It does not try to say what the world is. It aims to activate a condition of the world, a condition in which order is reestablished, relationships are returned to their proper places, and the community can continue living with the feeling that things have not slipped from their familiar orbit. In that logic, writing is not descriptive, but practical. A line of text does not merely transmit meaning, it produces efficacy. When spoken at the right time, within the right ritual, it does not announce something new. It makes what is already known present again. It does not provide data. It reactivates collective memory of how the world should function. Place names in ancient texts illustrate this most clearly. They are not written down to be referenced as a catalog. They are written down to be invoked. When a place name is spoken aloud in ritual, it pulls with it the entire web of relations attached to it. Riverland law authority and the times the community has endured instability. Naming does not provide directions. It returns the world to the right order in that moment. When we detach text from ritual, we turn an action into an object. We turn invocation into description, efficacy into information. And in doing so, the text loses its core function. Modern questions like, what does this mean, or what does it describe, quietly replace the more important, ancient question. When and where was it used? That misunderstanding leads to further drift. Place names are read as locations to be identified. Names are read as abstract symbols to be decoded. And ritual, where all these elements come together, is pushed into a secondary role as a decorative layer of belief. But in the ancient world, ritual was never secondary. It was the engine. Without ritual, the text does not run. Without the right time, the name does not take effect. In that sense, an ancient text is more like an instrument than a record. An instrument placed on a table makes no sound. Only when played at the right tempo in the right setting does it become music. Ancient writing is the same. Only when placed within ritual, within time cycles and specific social space, does it become an action that holds order. When modern interpretation returns these texts to the silence of the library, it unintentionally demands that they do something they were never made to do. And when the text fails to meet that expectation, the gap gets filled again with conjecture, with hypotheses detached from the original context. But if we pause and return the texts to their proper environment, the environment of action, recitation ritual, we begin to see clearly ancient texts do not tell us a story to understand. They give the community a tool to use. And it is here that the missing key behind many modern interpretations becomes visible. The text is not meant to describe the world. It is meant to keep the world in a livable condition. Place names are written not to sit on clay, but to be spoken at the right moment, when order must be recalled, when uncertainty must be placed into a frame, and when the community must believe that the world, fragile as it is still standing. This disconnection pushes many modern interpretations into two extremes. One side dismisses the entire system as superstition imagination, with no value beyond literature. The other side drives it toward extreme supernaturalism, where every gap is filled with hypotheses about aliens or omnipotent civilizations that vanished. Both readings miss the core, the Anunnaki, and the place names associated with them do not need to be real in a physical sense to have value. They are real in an operational sense. They did what society needed them to do. What matters is that these far-reaching interpretations do not come from malice or simple ignorance. They come from a modern unease. In a world where order is assumed to be designable, controllable, optimizable, seeing an ancient society maintain stability through memory and ritual confuses us. Instead of learning from how they lived with uncertainty, we try to turn them into a rough version of ourselves, assigning them technology maps and ambitions we recognize. But in doing so, we lose the chance to understand something far more important. The Sumerian world did not run on infinite expansion. It ran on conscious limitation. They did not try to know everything. They tried to remember correctly what must not be forgotten. They did not seek an explanation for the universe. They sought to keep the relationship between waterland people and law from breaking. Modern interpretations go too far when they make the Anunnaki the answer to questions the ancients never asked. But when we step back, remove the need to shock, remove the demand to find some vast secret, the texts begin to speak in a lower, slower, and more honest voice. They do not promise hidden knowledge. They remind us of a skill that was once deeply necessary, the ability to hold order in a world that is not certain. And perhaps here, modern interpretation can stop not to dismiss or deify the past, but to listen to it in its true context. Because those texts do not need us to believe in anything extraordinary. They only need us to understand that there was once a time when human beings survived not by knowing more, but by remembering more accurately. When every noisy layer of interpretation has been stripped away, when distant planets lost technologies and spectacular hypotheses gradually withdraw what remains of the so-called Anunnaki map, is not a hidden secret, but a quiet legacy. A legacy that does not lie in new information, but in the way ancient people learned to survive in an uncertain world. That legacy does not give us another missing piece of the universe's structure, nor does it reveal an advanced science buried by time. It does not satisfy the modern hunger for discovery, bringing no invention opening, no door to faraway realms. Instead, it offers a different lesson, quieter but far deeper. that there once existed societies that did not try to master the world by measuring it, classifying it, or endlessly expanding the boundaries of what they knew, but by remembering correctly the relationships that kept the world from slipping out of a livable state. In that way of thinking, knowledge is not an instrument of conquest, but a means of maintenance. Knowing more does not necessarily mean being safer. Only correctly remembering the right thing, remembering what must not be forgotten, creates the possibility of continuing to exist. Those societies understood that the world does not need to be fully decoded in order to function. What matters more is recognizing where the most fragile connections are and doing everything possible to keep those connections from breaking across time. The Anunnaki map, if we still use that term, is therefore not a map of expansion. It does not encourage people to leave familiar space in search of new horizons. It does not ask what lies beyond. On the contrary, it poses a far more cautious question: what is keeping this place standing? And from that question, it teaches people how to remain in the right place, not the right place in the sense of coordinates on the ground, but the right place within the structure of order that a community relies on to survive. In this map, space is not measured by the distance one must travel, but by the degree of stability it provides. A place matters not because it is wide or narrow, high or low, but because there people once endured upheaval. A bend in a river, a stretch of land, a ritual center, or a name repeated over time, none of these has value unless it proves that it helped the world not collapse in the most unpredictable moments. Whatever once helped people survive floods, droughts, crises of power, that becomes worth remembering. And once it becomes worth remembering, it is no longer a choice. It becomes an obligation to remember. Places that keep law effective, not merely on paper, but in collective feeling, are places that must be named correctly at the correct time. That act of naming is not meant to describe space. It is meant to activate the memory of order. It tells the community we once stood firm here in this way. And the repetition of that naming creates a sense of continuity, so that the world, though volatile, does not become entirely unfamiliar. For that reason, places that have proven their survival value are not permitted to fall into oblivion. Forgetting them is not merely losing a fragment of memory, it is weakening the invisible structure that holds society together. In this way of thinking, forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is a risk. And the Anunnaki map exists not to open the world, but to guard the memory of how the world was once held steady, a memory repeated long enough to become a foundation for survival. This legacy shows that ancient intelligence was not the intelligence of limitless expansion, but the intelligence of conscious limits. The ancients did not believe that knowing more is always better. They believed that knowing rightly, right timing, right role, right order is what decides everything. Knowledge not placed into the correct operational structure can become a burden. By contrast, knowledge repeated long enough to become self-evident can support an entire society. Seen this way, the Anunnaki map does not belong to the past. It is not buried beneath clay, nor does it lie still in a museum. It continues to exist as a mental framework, a way of approaching the world that humanity once relied on in its most fragile eras. When the environment is unpredictable, when nature refuses to follow plans, and when authority must be legitimized to prevent disintegration, people do not seek novelty. They seek continuity. That is what makes this legacy difficult for us to recognize today. We live in a world that celebrates innovation, where maps are constantly updated, where knowledge is measured by speed of expansion, and where memory is often treated as a drag on progress. In such a world, a system built on repetition, on naming old points correctly, can be mistaken for stagnation or superstition. But if we place ourselves among communities living inside uncertainty, the value of that legacy becomes clearer. The Anunnaki map did not help them avoid disasters. It did not promise absolute safety. What it did was reduce panic. It allowed people to believe that even if everything could change, there was still a structure durable enough to return to. And in moments when fear can dissolve society faster than any natural catastrophe, that belief is a resource for survival. The true legacy of the Anunnaki map lies in showing that memory can be a technology. Not a technology of machines, but a technology of repetition of norms, of correct naming. A technology that requires neither metal nor energy, but requires human agreement on what must not be forgotten. That technology does not produce breakthroughs, but it produces durability. And in the long history of humanity, durability is often more important than breakthrough. Looking back from the present, we can see that many societies collapse, not because they lack knowledge, but because they lose the ability to sustain a shared order. When anchors are forgotten, when rituals lose efficacy, when law is no longer felt as legitimate, a society can unravel even when resources still exist. The Anunnaki map reminds us that order does not exist on its own. It must be invoked, reaffirmed, and placed into collective memory again and again. This legacy also poses an uncomfortable question to the modern world. When everything is measured, drawn, and stored as data, do we still have place names in the functional sense, points that, if forgotten, would cause our order to wobble? Do we still have rituals strong enough to reestablish a sense of continuity when we face crisis? Or have we traded our entire capacity to anchor order for surface-level flexibility? The Anunnaki map does not provide answers to those questions, and perhaps it was never made to do so. Its legacy is not a message sent to the future, but a mirror. A mirror showing that there once were societies that survived not by understanding the world exhaustively, but by placing the world into relationships that could be endured. When we look into that legacy, what matters is not whether we believe in the Anunnaki or not. What matters is whether we recognize the value of a mode of thought that does not treat stability as self-evident. A mode of thought that understands that order must always be maintained. That memory exists not merely to recall, but to operate, and that some things must be repeated, not because they are old, but because they once kept the world standing. And if the Anunnaki map can still say anything to us today, perhaps it is this gentle but stern reminder in a world that is growing more complex, where change moves faster than our ability to adapt. The most important legacy is not how many new things we come to know, but whether we do not lose the anchors that once helped humans endure their most fragile eras. That true legacy does not lie in clay tablets dried hard across millennia, nor in cuneiform signs preserved behind museum glass. It does not belong to matter, nor is it confined to the past. It exists somewhere else in how human beings question the world they live in. Because the question determines what is noticed, what is kept, and what slowly disappears from collective memory. The ancients did not question the world the way we are used to questioning it today. They did not begin with the ambition to go farther faster or to control more. They lived in a reality where existence was always fragile, where a single season out of rhythm could push an entire community to the edge. In that context, the most urgent question was not what lies ahead, but what is keeping this present from falling apart. That question did not point outward, but inward toward the deep structure of life, toward the links between people and land-water law and shared memory. When we reread ancient texts with the patience they require, what appears is not an obsession with distant origins or supernatural power, but a profoundly human concern how the world can continue to resemble itself after upheaval. The Anunnaki, the repeated place names the river-mountain-sky axis. All of it turns around a single center, sustaining the survivability of order. Not perfect order, but order durable enough that people still know where they stand. Today we live in a world that seems more stable, supported by technology data and complex systems. Yet precisely because of that, we easily forget to ask that older question. We ask about speed growth expansion. We ask how far we can go, how deep we can understand, how quickly we can change the world. Those questions are not wrong, but when they become the only questions, they can obscure something more important, what is silently holding this system up. The legacy of the Anunnaki map reminds us that not every foundation is visible. Some orders exist only when they are named correctly, when memory of each part's role is still shared. When those anchors are forgotten, whether in ancient society or modern, the collapse rarely arrives as a single shock. It arrives as disorientation, as the feeling that nothing remains solid enough to return to. Therefore, the most important question may never have changed. It is not the question of the limits of exploration, but the question of what is keeping this world from collapsing, and whether we still clearly remember which relationships are performing that role. In that question, ancient legacy no longer belongs to the past. It becomes a quiet reminder for any society that believes it is standing firmly without needing to remember why. And as we arrive at the final lines of this journey, perhaps what remains is not a mystery that has been solved, but a very slow settling of the mind. Those ancient place names, those names repeated across thousands of years, do not in the end lead us to any specific location on a modern map. They do not guide our feet. They do not promise a breathtaking discovery. They do only one thing, something far quieter than that. They remind us of how fragile the world once was. In an age when everything could vanish after a single flood season, a stretch of drought, or a small misalignment in ritual and social order, human beings could not rely on certainty. They could rely only on memory. And that memory was not preserved on paper, not through hand-drawn maps, but through names spoken again and again, pressed into clay, recited in ritual, passed from one generation to the next, as a way of anchoring the world so that it would not slip entirely beyond human reach. The Anunnaki, in their deepest meaning, were not beings who came from a distant place. They were the way ancient people gave a name to the forces that kept the world from collapsing all at once. And the map they left behind was not a map of space, but a map of order. An order built from rivers, from mountains, from the sky, from the rhythm of rising and receding waters, from remembering the places that had to be remembered, and calling by name the things that must not be forgotten. If you are listening to this story late into the night, as your thoughts begin to slow and the outside world gradually fades, let those names remain with you, not as questions, but as a gentle reminder that before human beings learned how to conquer the world, they first learned how to remember it. And sometimes that is the most enduring form of intelligence of all. And before we close completely, I would like to pause here for just a moment. If you are still listening, if this voice is still with you in this quiet hour of the night, please leave a comment. Just tell me, where are you listening from? And right now, what time is it for you? It might be a dark room. It might be a night journey. It might be a place very far away that I have never set foot in. Those answers are not for statistics, but to remind us that even though each of us is in a different place in the world, we are still sharing the same moment of silence. I wish you a very deep night.